Hi.
Low again. Page 69 and 70 of the Proclaimer's book, there's two boxes. And the first box is entitled, No Men on Earth More Highly Favored.
On June 21, 1918, J.F. Rutherford and several of his close associates were sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, having been falsely convicted of conspiracy. Their feelings? In a handwritten note dated June 22, 23, from Raymond Street Jail in Brooklyn, New York, Brother Rutherford wrote, "There are probably no men on earth today more highly favored and who are happier than the 7 brethren now in prison. They are conscious of their entire innocence of intentional wrongdoing and rejoice to be suffering with Christ for loyally serving him."
From the second box on page 70 is Victims of Clergy-Inspired Persecution. By the middle of 1918, J.F. Rutherford and 7 of his associates were in prison, victims of clergy-inspired opposition. But those 8 men were not the only targets of such hatred. During earlier years, it had been C.T. Russell who was primarily the object of attack by the clergy and the press. Now the Bible students themselves were victims. The Golden Age, now awake, of September 29, 1920, published a graphic, extensive report of vicious persecution they endured in the United States. It read like something out of the Inquisition. Included were the following accounts. This one dated April 22, 1918. At Wynwood, Oklahoma, Claude Watson was first jailed and then deliberately released to a mob composed of preachers, businessmen, and a few others that knocked him down, caused a Negro to whip him, and, when he had partially recovered, to whip him again. They then poured tar and feathers all over him, rubbing the tar into his hair and scalp.
And the next one is dated April 29, 1918, at Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. W.B. Duncan, 61 years of age, Edward French, Charles Frank, and a Mr. Griffin and a Mrs. D. Van Hosen were jailed. The jail was broken into by a mob that used the most vile and obscene language, whipped, tarred, and feathered, and drove them from town. Duncan was compelled to walk 26 miles to his home and barely recovered. Griffin was virtually blinded and died from the assault a few months later. The next one is dated April 30, 1918. At Minerva, Ohio, S.H. Griffin was first jailed and then released to a mob, then lectured 15 minutes by the minister, then struck repeatedly, cursed, kicked, trodden upon, threatened with hanging and with drowning, driven from town, spit upon, tripped repeatedly, jabbed repeatedly with an umbrella, forbidden to ride, followed 5 miles to Malvern, Ohio, rearrested, jailed for safety at Carrollton, and finally taken home by brave and faithful officials who, after examining his literature, said, in so many words, "We find no fault in this man."
Well, we deplore any mob action, and mob action is usually the consequence of misunderstanding or even understanding rightly what one is standing for. So we don't want to in any way give the signal that we do agree with what happened here.
Yeah, it's never justifiable to treat people violently like this.
And yet you realize, if you know the context again of the time, what were they saying that incited this kind of anger from mobs? And then you realize that if you had read the Finnish mystery as we have, you would realize what it was that was giving incentive to people to oppose you, if not be violent towards you. So we can be pretty sure they've picked the worst examples here. But we notice that this is not martyrdom. You are being mobbed, you're being tarred and feathered, chased out of town, abused, yes, verbally and physically sometimes. That's not even the case, though, with the leaders. In the first box where you have the arrest and the attitude of Brother Rutherford and his 7 helpers or co-workers in jail in New York, they are not being abused. They're incarcerated. Why are they incarcerated? Because they're viewed as the ones sending the incendiaries around. But what are the incendiaries? That's what makes that last sentence in the first box so laughable to me. They are conscious of their entire innocence of intentional wrongdoing and rejoice to be suffering with Christ for loyally serving him. What were they distributing that brought this mob violence upon them over the months from 1917 to 1918?
The Finnish mystery.
What's the Finnish mystery full of?
Well, it's full of hatred towards Christendom, clergy, Christians. Outside of Watchtower, everybody else is counted as worthy of death. So in the Finnish mystery, it actually says in 1918, the churches will be destroyed wholesale, and church members, by the millions,
of church members will
all be destroyed.
So is this suffering for Christ? That's the question I think you have to ask. Is Christ the object or the subject of the Finnish mystery of their preaching at that time? They're preaching a Christ who came invisibly in 1874 and who was going to judge and destroy the churches wholesale in 1918.
Yeah, so they are inciting hatred, if not at least anger, from the communities who are being told they're all going to die shortly, and it was not true.
It wasn't true. So false prophecy, slander of the churches, because of course you're not recognizing the churches do anything good or for Christ.
Yeah.
You are saying in effect that Christ is going to judge them all, but not you. You're going to be vindicated because they're also saying that after this happens to the churches, then they're going to turn to the works of Pastor Russell.
So they may not be giving a date for this, but they're still saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to be destroyed that's not a Jehovah's Witness.
I couldn't help but notice the dates of the 3 incidents that we read on page 70. They're all April of 1918. This is around the time that the churches are supposed to be destroyed and the church members by the millions. So if you're doing that in a time of crisis, America is at war at the time. If you're doing this in a time of crisis, expect the worst. Well, now, that's not to say that we justify any of it. But if you want to mollify your enemies, you don't preach that stuff at them as good news.
So the fact that they say they're victims of clergy-inspired opposition. No, they're victims of what they wrote, and it stirred up anger. Who did the stirring up? It wasn't the clergy that stirred up. They stirred up by what they wrote, what they said.
And we know this is not a one-off. It wasn't just the Finnish mystery, because this goes on for a decade after. This attitude of hatred towards anyone who dares oppose your doctrine is this. It's not as, I don't think it's as hard-hitting now. Last week we saw that phrase that they use about hard-hitting message. What a hard-hitting message on the top of page 70. It's hard-hitting, but it hit you the hardest because you've had to discard the stuff you were preaching then.
Yeah.
So this to me contrasts with what you read in 1 Peter, for instance, when Peter is talking about suffering. Peter seems to have written 1 Peter during the first phase of the Neronian persecution, the first great persecution of the church in the Gentile world. And when he wrote this, he was pointing out that your behavior as Christians has a lot to do with how people will treat you. So I'm thinking particularly of chapter 2, 1 Peter 2, verses 19 to 23.
And you were going to read that.
This is a gracious thing, when mindful of God one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, That is, when you sin, you are beaten for it, you endure. But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So I think the verbs that struck me hardest reading this in advance was the word deceit. Is there any deceit in the Finnish mystery that you yourselves have repudiated in subsequent history?
Yeah.
There was no deceit found in Christ's mouth. When he was reviled, did he revile in return?
And they're starting the reviling. No, we're not excusing people for reviling back, but they initiated this reviling. Their publications are full of reviling.
Not so much Russell, though.
Yeah,
Finnish mystery and beyond.
Yeah, yeah, not as much. I think though towards the end of Russell's life, he did start to. He's now got an audience. He's got followers. And full of himself, kind of that. That happens when people are constantly telling you, you're the greatest thing. You're the FTS. You're the voice of God. If people are saying that, it's likely going to go to a person's head.
Yeah, and then there's the third verb here. When he suffered, that is, Christ suffered, he did not threaten. Remember Christ's silence before his accusers. Is this Rutherford's style?
Yeah.
Is it the style of the Finnish mystery? What could be more threatening than telling people they're going to die this year and your churches are going to be destroyed?
And he's saying, if you are suffering for doing good, can we say that printing the Finnish mystery was doing good and publishing it widely and distributing it widely? Was that doing good? I think read the Finnish mystery and see if you think that would be called doing good.
And then we've got chapter 4, right?
Verses 12 to 17. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when the glory is revealed, you may be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yours said something other than busybody, right?
It said a meddler.
Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God?
So I guess we've got to ask, are they insulted and suffering for the name of Christ? And are they glorifying God in the public utterances? Is the Finnish mystery glorifying God?
Or are they suffering for the name of Russell and Rutherford?
Well, it's true that Rutherford's name wasn't well known to the public yet, but it would become well known. And they were then, of course, referred to as the disciples of Russell and Rutherford. But in those days, it was Russellites. That was the common public perception of who you're talking about.
And they attributed the Finnish mystery to Russell.
Yeah, the posthumous work of Pastor Russell.
Yeah.
We've got a link, which is, I think, one of the videos you made about Rutherford's book, Reconciliation. I think it's called Reviling, Slander,
Hatred of
Enemies.
JW's learned from a master, Rutherford. And then the playlist, the slander playlist. In that that particular video, there's a quote in the thumbnail that you might want to pay attention to, because they say, this is from Reconciliation, written by Rutherford. He says, the clergy do not represent God and Christ, but do represent God's enemy, the devil. So they haven't learned anything from this. And I would have to say, even from our own experience, it's not that all witnesses are harsh, but there are. I've known witnesses that were pretty obnoxious. Even since I've left, I've had some call on me, and some of them just seem to be blank, not very communicative. But then there are some that are very aggressive, very obnoxious. And, so, and they're usually young, right? There's a lot of young witnesses that come to the door, teenagers.
I remember going door to door frequently with pioneers in my younger days. I would be about 21 to 24 at this time, in my first flush of enthusiasm. And I was often going with younger pioneers, that teenagers who were off school for the summer.
Yeah.
Some of them were just downright arrogant, and if they weren't arrogant, they were condescending.
Yeah. You can't say that we're speaking with respect.
No.
Listening to people and speaking with respect.
That's another text we could have read in 1 Peter, isn't it? 1 Peter 3, between the two texts we read, where he says, when you are giving a defense for the faith you hold, you do it with humility and deep respect.
So when you get bad reactions, you have to think about, is it because of what I'm saying or the way I'm saying it? Is it because I'm being disrespectful that I'm getting persecuted?
Yeah.
Getting the door slammed in my face or whatever. So that's a caution for everyone.
Yeah.
But I think people are let loose on the public too easily, because you're all supposed to be out there.
Yeah.
When you're a witness.
Yeah. No one's really monitoring what kind of tone you're taking. All they're monitoring is what you're using as literature, but not the attitude you carry with you. I don't remember much talk about that back in the day before 1975, when I was a young pioneer.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll see you soon.
Watch for the links.